To a certain extent, the Roman Empire had always been militarized. We've seen this in this podcast. Soldiers helped select emperors. They enforced his edict. They were the basis of his legitimacy. This was true even in periods where Roman senators were prominent in government. But by the time we get to the end of the 3rd century AD, there was a quantitative, if not qualitative, difference in the extent to which the military was involved in virtually all aspects of Roman society. Everything from the way that labor was organized to the divisions of provinces, tax collection. On today's episode, I want to talk in a little more detail about what this society looked like, the extent to which the Roman military in substance or in style influenced the kinds of things that were previously left to individuals to do on their own or were based in civic or legal traditions. And I think you'll see that the world of Diocletian and the emperors that followed was very different than the empire from, say, Augustus to Marcus Aurelius. Let's talk about the militarization of the Roman Empire on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 80. The military takes over the Roman Empire. Folks, before we get started, I just want to put a plug for a few things. First, if you haven't bought my book, Pax Romana, The Plague That Shook the Roman World, which is all about the Antonine Plague that struck the Roman Empire under Marcus Aurelius in the 2nd century AD, you can buy that book anywhere books are sold. You can buy the hardcover, Kindle, and audiobook editions now. Paperback edition is following in just a couple of months. Secondly, if you haven't tried out my YouTube channel yet, please search for my name, Colin Elliott, or my handle, Prof. CPE, over at YouTube. You can get some lectures and content that you can't get here. I also want to mention that I was a guest on the Bible and Archaeology podcast, and that episode has now gone live, so you can check out my interview on Julius Caesar on the Bible and Archaeology podcast. Lastly, if you enjoy this podcast, you can certainly do things like subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. But if you'd like to throw a little tip my way, there is a link in the show notes that goes to a PayPal link, and you can send me a donation of whatever it is you like. Thanks so much for listening. Let's get to today's episode. We talked last time about the formation of the Tetrarchy. This was a group of 4 men led by the Emperor Diocletian, in which the Roman Empire was effectively divided up on a meritocratic basis between men that were not related to each other or in the same family. And the idea here was to subjugate the chaos that had sprung up in the 3rd century, to put down rebellions, secure the borders, and rule the Roman Empire with a level of force and detail that had never been seen before. And so it's probably unsurprising that this system, with its intensity and use of armies and the personal touch of warlord emperors, is not surprising that this society became increasingly militarized. Just the number of soldiers alone expanded greatly during this period. By the beginning of the 3rd century, there were probably around 300,000 soldiers in the Roman army. Under the Tetrarchs, that number ballooned to somewhere around 500,000, maybe even going as high as 600,000 soldiers. The expansions happened most significantly in 2 areas. First, at the borders. Roman soldiers permanently garrisoned along the most contentious Roman frontiers were already becoming a fixture by the beginning of the 3rd century. By the end, several 100,000 troops were dedicated to the purpose of guarding Rome's borders. The other place where we see an increase in soldiers was in mobile armies that were under direct control of the empire. These are the thousands of personal soldiers that went with each emperor wherever he went. These were not household guards or Praetorian guards. No, these were regular soldiers, thousands of men strong in units, marching with an emperor from city to city. By the time of Constantine, the emperor's traveling entourage swelled to tens of thousands of soldiers and administrators. Long gone were the days of emperors traveling with just a few guards or senators or family members. From now on, whenever an emperor went somewhere, he took thousands of soldiers with him. And of course, with such a large army, Roman emperors decided to create new leadership positions as well. The most important of these being the magister militum, or master of soldiers. This was the top military official overseeing the entire Roman army in terms of both strategy and administration. And as we will see in the episodes to follow, this person at times became even more powerful and influential than the emperors themselves. With so many troops moving around the Roman Empire or being stationed on the borders, it's not surprising that the language of the military, which was Latin, became the empire's sole official language during the time of the Tetrarchy at the end of the 3rd century. Prior to this, we would see imperial edicts regularly issued in local languages, especially Greek in the East, but now all edicts were supposed to be officially issued in Latin. And this, of course, reflects the dominance of the military at this time. Finally, I want to say something about where these soldiers were coming from, because not all of them were Roman citizens. To fill the ranks of the growing Roman military, emperors increasingly relied on outsiders. Gothic peoples, Frankish peoples, Germanic tribesmen, and many others were pulled into the Roman army as what were called foederati. These were non-Roman men of fighting age made officially part of the Roman army, in some cases given military training and tactics, and then placed in a particular part of the empire in settlements in order to defend those areas against other foreigners who might cross into Roman territory. As you can imagine, this system was a short-term solution that would eventually backfire. Not always the best idea to train your enemies in the tactics that could be used to defeat you, and the Romans will find this out the hard way, but again, we'll get to that a little bit later in another episode. When these soldiers spoke to their emperor, they did not address him as princeps, first citizen. Instead, they addressed him as dominus, which is lord or master. Diocletian and the other emperors were not civilian leaders who simply had charge of the military by default. No, these were men with military training. They came out of the legions. They were of the military culture. When we see Diocletian and other emperors that come after him represented in images or on coins, they're not wearing togas or wearing laurel crowns as often as they are wearing military apparel. Their beards are cut short in a soldier style, as is their hair. They carry weapons. Their faces are often grimaced and grizzled, showing a stern toughness in their demeanor. And the idea of emperors as masters sort of took on a life of its own. It's at this time that we begin to see the nimbus, otherwise known as a halo, surrounding the heads of Roman emperors, symbolizing divine authority. We know from literary sources and other descriptions of individuals meeting with emperors that Diocletian and the emperors that followed him expected prostration when their subjects came into their presence. The emperors of the Principate demanded no such rituals of humiliation. And perhaps most characteristic of this new type of society, we see emperors issuing commands in virtually all areas of Roman society, believing that in the same way that they issue orders to troops and then see things happen, that emperors could order the economy or order religion or order labor, simply issuing decrees that thus and such should happen and then expecting their empire to fall in line. In some cases, this worked. In other cases, it failed spectacularly. The Christian writer Lactantius, who lived through the reign of Diocletian, had this to say about the Tetrarchy. Quote, Diocletian overturned the Roman Empire, for he made choice of 3 persons to share the government with him, and thus the empire having been cut into 4 pieces, armies were multiplied. Each of the 4 princes strove to maintain a much more considerable military force than any sole emperor had done in times past. There began to be fewer men who paid taxes than there were who received wages. The provinces were divided into minute portions, and many governors and a multitude of inferior officers lay heavy on each territory and almost on every city. That's Lactantius in his work on the deaths of the persecutors. What is he talking about? Well, under the new system of tetrarchs, there was a huge growth, not only in soldiers, as I just mentioned, but also in the bureaucracy. Diocletian and his colleagues divided the empire up into over 100 small provinces within 12 larger dioceses. These were collections of provinces, and there were officials at all levels of this multi-tiered provincial system, the total number being something like 30,000. To give you some perspective, under the Principate, there were probably fewer than 1,000 administrators over all Roman provinces. The idea here was to create smaller divisions in the empire to ensure that each and every parcel of land was taxed. And many of the officials in charge of the provinces were put there to levy taxes and assess property. And in fact, the level of detail even went down as far as the individual. This is very normal in our society, where many people in many countries pay individual income taxes. But to accomplish intensified individual taxation in the Roman Empire took a huge bureaucratic effort. It also required the emperors to control labor and land ownership in ways that had not been done before. What emerged was something called the colonate. This was a system in which peasants were forced to stay on a particular parcel of land so that they would only work that land and then be taxed on only that land. Now, this kind of sounds like slavery, and there are many ways that this was like slavery, but in legal terms, these coloni were free. They did not have the status of slaves. But functionally speaking, apart from short occasional trips and some very limited rights against their landowners, they were otherwise required to farm one particular plot of land and pay taxes in kind, so out of the produce of the land, directly to the government. And we see numerous laws in surviving Roman legal codices that speak to the conditions of these bound men, these coloni. There were even runaway colonus laws, such as this one from 332 AD. Quote, any person whatsoever in whose possession a colonus belonging to another is found, not only shall restore the said colonus to his place of origin, but shall also assume the tax on him for the time that he had him. As for the coloni themselves, it will be proper for such as contemplate flight to be bound with chains to a servile status, so that by virtue of such condemnation to servitude, they may be compelled to fulfill the duties that befit free men. That's from the Theodosian Code. So this is a law that ensures that a colonus who ran away from his allocated property be returned, that the person who had him for a period of time pay the tax. That's obviously the most important part of this law. And then that any colonus who ran away from his land would need to be effectively made a slave and held in chains, which was demeaning for a free person. By the time we get to the mid-4th century, the restrictions on coloni had grown. Here is another law, for example, from the Theodosian Code, dating from 365 AD. Quote, Coloni do not have the right to alienate the fields that they cultivate, to the extent that even if they have any belongings of their own, they may not transfer them to others without the advice and knowledge of their patrons. Again, that's from the Theodosian Code. So what's going on here? A colonist could have personal possessions, but they need to get permission from their landlord if they try to sell them. Now again, this is slavery in all but name. And it's likely the case that this new kind of peasant labor gradually replaced slavery in the Roman Empire. Slavery had been on the decline, by the way, at least insofar as we can tell, from as early as the 1st century AD. We expect, of course, that the agricultural workers, many of the poorest and lowest status in Roman society, would be among the first to be bound in this way. But it may surprise you to learn that other professions were also bound in place under this new militarized system under the tetrarchs. Key roles like soldiers, bakers, even city councilors became hereditary, and it was required that sons follow their fathers in these professions. We have numerous laws from the 4th century reiterating that the sons of certain professionals could not leave that profession and do something else. They had to take on the job that their fathers had, especially in areas which were essential to the military. That's why we see soldiers, bread bakers, shipmasters, and others included in that list. But what's pretty amazing is that these restrictions went all the way up to the middling elites that served on city councils in the cities of the Roman Empire. These were men who had previously earnestly desired to serve in these positions. They were highly prestigious. They required a lot of wealth to undertake. They allowed people to engage in various benefactions to their cities. These were men who wanted the higher status associated with being a leader in a local city. But by the time we get to the Tetrarchic period, there were fewer and fewer men that wanted to serve as local elites. And the laws in the Theodosian Code show that they try and escape. Here's a law from AD 325, for example. Quote, "Since some men desert the municipal councils and flee for refuge to the protection of the military service, we command that all persons who are found to be not yet under the authority of the chief centurion shall be discharged from the military service and shall be returned to the municipal council from which they came." Again, that's from the Theodosian Code. Here's another one, dating from the very next year, AD 326. Quote, "Since we have learned that the municipal councils are being left desolate by those persons who are obligated to them through their birth status and who are requesting imperial services for themselves through supplications to the emperor and are running away to the legions and various government offices, if any should apprehend any persons with less than 20 terms of service in governmental offices, they shall drag such persons back to the municipal councils." Again, that's the Theodosian Code. So we see in here local elites fleeing to where? The military, in order to escape having to serve. Now, why were they doing this? Because the burdens of running the government had increasingly fallen on local elites over the past couple centuries. Well, the emperors increasingly asked these people to do things that were not financially sustainable, and so they were losing their fortunes and losing their lands. The obligations became increasingly burdensome, and eventually these men had little other choice but to get out of these positions. But the Roman government still needed them. And so they passed laws like these ones, forcing these men to stay in their post, even if it meant losing all their property and wealth. It's really telling that these men fled into the legions to try and escape. Legionaries were not highly paid. Their job was very risky. But in a society where the military was now more important than the normal civilian government, having a low position in the military was now far more valuable than having one of the highest positions, that is, a city councilor, in the civil government. That says volumes about the nature of militarization under this new system. Finally, there was one other way where we really see militarization take over, and that is in the economy. As we'll see in the next episode, Diocletian and the emperors attempted something that had never been done before in Roman history: to set maximum prices on most essential goods in the Roman Empire. This sweeping reform, with lists of prices posted in many Roman cities, the inscriptions of which still survive in a few places, this action was a monumental undertaking. But would it be successful? And were there consequences for attempting an economic intervention on a scale that even most modern countries would not dare to do? And so I want to talk about the Edict on Maximum Prices, its aims, and its effects on the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocore. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.